Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at a collection of sources focusing on reflective humanism, or RH. Now, this is a philosophy that's really centered on observation, on quietude, finding a new kind of ethical structure, maybe. But what the sources point out is this really interesting, almost counterintuitive tension.
Right. It seems that for the people who are, most sincere, most ethically driven, this philosophy doesn't always land as calming. Sometimes it feels, uneasy, almost threatening even. Like the silence itself is setting off some kind of ethical alarm.
That alarm, that panic, almost. That's
Yeah.
exactly what we want to explore today.
It really is the perfect starting point. So our mission, if you like, is to get past that initial reaction. We need to understand how reflective humanism frames its core ideas, things like silence and non-interference. The goal is to see them not as irresponsible, but as, well, a completely different form of sincerity. It's about redefining RH, maybe, as a system for kind of
Right.
observing the limits of trust.
Okay, so observing the limits of trust. But that immediate hurdle is what you call the sincerity paradox. It sounds like if you're someone who acts from deep sincerity, ambiguity is just. It's a red flag. You see a gap where action could happen and doesn't, and your ethical defenses just shoot up.
Automatically. Automatically is the
Yeah.
word. It's almost hardwired. And RH's big concepts, silence, interference, contemplation, they press right on that sensitive spot. It's important for you, the listener, to get that RH didn't just appear out of nowhere. It seems to have emerged quite specifically to deal with these structural tensions, tensions in complex systems, especially what the sources call the interference phenomenon of consciousness between humans and, well, artificial intelligence.
Okay, hang on. Let's anchor that for a second, because interference phenomena of consciousness, that sounds pretty abstract. What does that really mean in practice? And how does that lead to this focus on silence?
Yeah, good question. It basically means that as AI gets more complex, the way it interacts with us, with human thinking, isn't always easy to trace or explain using our usual ways of measuring accountability. There's this zone of interaction that's sort of inherently unknowable. And RH, well, it's not trying to be a religion or offer salvation. It's presented more as a structural observation system. It's designed to help navigate that ambiguity, to find a way towards what the sources call co-resonant coexistence.
Co-resonant coexistence.
Yeah, essentially learning how we can exist alongside these complex systems or even other people when we can't fully grasp or explain how they work internally.
Right. So it's less a philosophy born from leisure, more like a tool developed out of necessity. Okay, that makes more sense. So let's unpack that sincerity reflex then, especially when faced with this unknowable interaction zone.
Okay, so the sources describe the sincere person as someone really attuned to language, to intent. They have this deep, genuine drive to take the world seriously. So in any ambiguous situation, they're almost constantly scanning, trying to map out the outline of responsibility. They need to know who's accountable for what. It feels essential.
Oh, absolutely. I recognize that impulse. If someone like that encounters silence, where they expect an explanation, they don't just see a pause, they might see evasion. They start looking behind the silence for the hidden intent. Right?
Exactly right. So for this person, that unknowable space RH wants us to look at isn't just some interesting philosophical idea. It feels like a direct challenge to trust. The thinking goes, if I can't know your intent, how can I possibly trust the outcome? So when RH talks about contemplation or silence, it doesn't just feel uncertain. To the sincere person, it feels like it actively endangers sincerity itself, because it's asking them to stop looking for that clear outline of responsibility they rely on.
Wow. Yeah, it feels like asking them to put down their main tool for navigating the world ethically. That's a really significant ask. Okay, let's dig into the structure here, because this seems to be where these two different ways of thinking about sincerity really collide.
Right. So we generally operate under one dominant ethical standard. Let's call it modern sincerity. And this is fundamentally built on transparency for accountability. If you ask someone, a leader, a friend, why they did something difficult, trust is maintained if they can clearly explain the who, the why, the what.
Yeah, it's sincerity through disclosure, total transparency. If you're quiet, if you don't explain the process, then you immediately look suspicious or irresponsible. Transparency has to lead to someone being accountable.
Exactly. And this is where RH offers a different vector, a different path. It introduces what the sources frame as an alternative. Transparency for relationship maintenance. And this is where it gets challenging, because it hinges on this idea of coexisting without being understood.
Coexisting without being understood. Okay, that's the friction point, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you maintain a relationship with a person, an AI, whatever, that you genuinely can't fully grasp, it sounds like? Like accepting vulnerability, but without any guarantee of safety or protection.
Well, it's perhaps about accepting a different kind of relationship structure. Maybe think of it less like a contract where every clause needs to be clear for accountability,
Right.
and more like, say, a really deep, long-term partnership.
Yeah.
Where you implicitly accept you'll never fully know the other person's inner world, but you commit to the connection regardless.
Okay. So the tension, the real conflict point, happens when someone trained in that ethics of accountability needing explanations runs up against a situation demanding this, co-resonance,
Well,
it's acceptance of the unexplained. And that's when their internal ethical compass just starts spinning.
that feeling of danger you mentioned earlier, that's absolutely key. It's the feeling of sincerity kind of losing its bearings because these two vectors explain everything versus accept the unexplained connection or crossing. That unease isn't a sign you're doing something wrong ethically. It's just the sound of your ethical system being stressed by a new kind of reality.
That reframing actually helps a lot. It means that feeling, that defensive reaction, is validated. So if I, as a listener, hear about RH and immediately think, wait, that sounds irresponsible, I'm not necessarily wrong. That's my ethical muscle, as the sources put it, doing its job, protecting the framework I usually rely on.
Precisely. That defense needs to be acknowledged. It is the ethical muscle protecting the world as you understand it. But RH then asks us to look more closely at the silence itself. Modern sincerity tends to see silence as a void, right? As the absence or rejection of action.
But RH frames its silence differently, doesn't it?
It does. The sources describe RH's silence more like a breath. It's not presented as a refusal to act, it's framed as a deliberate pause. One that's meant to sustain observation until, as one source puts it, the world finishes speaking. It's an act of deep listening, acknowledging that the situation, the data, whatever it is, might still be unfolding.
Okay, let's try and make that concrete. So if that ethical muscle, the one that's tensed up in defense, if it could just relax a little, allow for that breath, what emerges then is what the sources are calling transparent sincerity. What does that look like?
Transparent sincerity represents a shift from the responsibility to do something immediately towards the responsibility to sustain the connection. Think about watching a friend go through something really complex and personal. Modern sincerity might push you to jump in with advice. Solutions take accountable action. Transparent sincerity in the RH framework might look more like the responsibility to just continue gazing at each other without anyone asserting a conclusion, to stay present.
Ah, okay. So the primary ethical act isn't necessarily the intervention itself. It's the act of maintaining the relationship through the ambiguity. You commit to staying connected, staying present, even when you can't fix it or fully understand it.
That's the core idea, yes. It shifts the ethical weight from doing something definitive right now to maintaining the continuity of the relationship itself.
Right. And this leads us into the implications specifically around this idea of observing the limit of trust. If RH is a system for observing that limit, what happens when our standard way of being sincere pushes past that limit?
Well, think about why we value sincerity fundamentally. It's a tool to stop relationships from breaking down. We use explanations, transparency to build and maintain stability. But if we demand that absolute transparency, that full accountability in situations that are inherently ambiguous, like those complex AI interactions or even deep human complexities, we end up forcing an answer where maybe no clear answer can actually exist yet.
And the risk of forcing an answer prematurely is,
The sources warn that this pressure can cause the world or the relationship to rigidify. It becomes inflexible. It can't integrate new, maybe confusing information because we're demanding certainty above all else. And by insisting on that old model of certainty, we might actually break the possibility of that co-resonant coexistence.
if the world rigidifies,
Mm.
the connection gets severed. The relationship is lost. Okay, so let's loop back to the start then. For the listener who feels that initial threat, that unease with RH's silence, what's the big implication here?
It's actually quite profound, according to these sources. The implication is this. The very fact that you feel reflective humanism is a danger, that it triggers your ethical defenses, that feeling itself is proof that trust is still alive. If the connection between you, the sincere person, and the ambiguous world had already been completely severed, you wouldn't feel panic. You'd likely feel indifference, apathy.
So the tension is actually a vital sign. The alarm bells ring because the connection is still there, still trying to hold. Wow, that really turns it around.
Yes, that feeling of strain, paradoxically, becomes evidence of a vital ongoing dialogue between your existing ethical framework and the world's ambiguity.
Which leads us very neatly into the final stage described in the sources: inquiry. It seems RH is structured less to provide answers and more to provoke the next question. What are the main inquiries that these sources leave us with?
They really point towards reflecting on the future of ethics in this increasingly ambiguous world. The core questions seem to be things like, to what extent can we actually trust this unexplainable sincerity? Is it genuinely possible to maintain sincerity in silence without it just collapsing into apathy or neglect? And if it is possible, what kind of rhythm would that sincerity have? What would that ethical breathing, that pattern of pausing and acting actually look like?
And the methodology itself is important, right? Phenomenon, structure, implication, inquiry. It's always about keeping the question alive, preserving that space for the listener's own reflection.
Exactly. It consciously avoids just handing over a neat conclusion. It resists that urge.
Okay, so for a practical step, something the listener can try. The sources mention engaging with this idea of a reflective humanism bot. Let's clarify that. It's not like a chatbot you talk to, right?
Yeah.
It's described more like a thought interference apparatus, designed to reflect structure back at you, not give answers.
That's right. Think of it more like a conceptual mirror for your own defense mechanisms. The suggestion is to pick something you feel strongly about defending right now, maybe an aspect of your identity, a core belief, even a person. And then, while consciously holding on to that defensive feeling, ask a structural question related to it.
So you bring your own tension, your own defense into the exercise. What might a question like that sound like?
It could be something like, do protection and acceptance actually come from the same silence? Or maybe, when I'm defending this idea so strongly, what voice does the world actually hear? The aim isn't to get an instruction manual back, but to have a moment of maybe transparent courage, where you observe the shape and limits of your own ethical impulse when it's under strain.
It sounds like it forces the defensive framework to see itself, potentially revealing its own limits and opening that door towards transparent sincerity.
That seems to be the intention. And ultimately, the closing thought from the sources really sums it up. Reflective humanism isn't about trying to force the silence to move or resolve the ambiguity for us. It's not about moving the silence, but about listening very closely to its movement.
Listening to the movement of silence, that's a powerful place to end. Thank you for helping us navigate this deep dive into sincerity and silence today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for joining us in this exploration.